Hello, this is the archivist. There are moments when a peaceful morning in a public place feels as ordinary as any other. The rustle of leaves, the distant laughter of children, the steady, reassuring rhythm of life. And then, without warning, something happens that changes everything. It shocks a community, it haunts investigators, and it forces a nation to look at itself in the mirror. What you're about to hear is the story of one of those moments. A case that begins on a hiking trail in a state park and ripples outward, touching questions of trust, of safety, and of the ways we try to protect the most vulnerable among us. A man who had once been trusted in classrooms is now at the center of a criminal investigation so brutal it stunned everyone who knew the victims. But this is more than a single headline. It is a story about how a community grapples with grief, how investigators reconstruct tiny fragments of time, and how a nation remembers the lessons of past tragedies while confronting the uncertainty of the present. This is the account of the teacher arrested after a park double homicide. It's a story of victims, investigators, and the long shadow of events that forced millions to rethink how children are kept safe. He was, by many accounts, an ordinary man, a teacher, aged 28, who had worked with children, who had stood in front of classrooms, who had once seemed, to colleagues and parents, committed to the work of education. He taught 5th grade. He left his school a year earlier to work elsewhere, but his name remained known in the community. Then, late one July morning on a popular hiking trail in Devil's Den State Park, an ordinary family outing turned catastrophic. The couple were Clinton and Kristen, names that will now forever be tied to that trail, to that day. They were on a hike with their 2 daughters, ages 7 and 9, a family outing any of us might recognize. Half a mile in a place that had been a source of recreation and peace for generations, they were attacked. The children miraculously survived. Their mother acted with courage that, by all accounts, saved them. The father was killed. The mother succumbed to her injuries. The scene was described by officials as horrific. The town held its breath. What the community could not have known in the immediate aftermath was this. The suspect arrested and charged for the killings was someone who had once stood in front of 5th graders. Someone whose life had been intimately connected to children and their education. The arrest sent a shockwave through 2 cities, the one where the victims lived and the one where the suspect had taught. This is where the story presses harder. A person entrusted with children's learning, a role that carries implicit trust, now accused of a crime so violent that it seemed to defy their former identity. How does that happen? How do investigators move from shock to evidence? What does a case like this ask of our systems, our law enforcement, and our communities? First, we need to understand what actually unfolded that day on the trail. Authorities reported the attack happened in the morning, not long after the family began their walk. By the time emergency services arrived, 2 people had been killed. The couple's 2 daughters, ages 7 and 9, had been present. Law enforcement praised the mother's actions. She had protected her children in a way that would save them from the worst of the violence. As investigators began piecing together the timeline, the presence of witnesses, trail cameras, and physical evidence became critical. Park trails are public spaces, but they are not immune to privacy lapses. Cell phones and hikers can capture snippets of time that investigators rely on to form their initial hypotheses. In this case, those pieces came together to point to a suspect, a man who had taught 5th grade at a public elementary school in a neighboring state. Shortly after, that man was taken into custody and charged with capital murder. His arrest was not, the authorities later said, a haphazard decision. It came after an investigation that included forensics, witness statements, and a review of surveillance and digital evidence. That is how most major criminal investigations proceed. A combination of the old, canvassing neighborhoods and following up on witness statements, and the new and digital footprints, cell phone records, and sometimes social media. The arrest prompted intense questions. Why was a teacher involved? Was there a motive? Were the victims chosen? Or was this a random act? The authorities were careful at first, describing the attack as apparently random and refraining from assigning motive until they could build a case. Those early words do not ease the heartache, but they indicate the methodical approach investigators must take. When a suspect is charged with such violent crimes, the media response is immediate and unavoidable. News outlets converged on the story, and the image of the accused, a teacher who once worked with children, became the focal point of national conversation. Parents and educators, already operating under the weight of many concerns, we're forced to reckon with an uncomfortable reality. Those who work with children are not monolithically benign, and trust, once shaken, is hard to rebuild. At the same time, we must remember that in the American criminal justice system, an arrest and charge do not equal guilt. In high-profile cases, the court of public opinion often delivers its own verdict before trials begin. That is why prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges have a duty to ensure due process. For the families involved, due process can feel like a delay. For the accused, it is a protection of basic rights. Let's pull back and look at the investigation itself. Police publicly described the assault as sudden and violent, occurring about half a mile into the trail. The children were nearby. The local sheriff described the attack as horrific, words chosen both to reflect the gravity of the crime and to relay the difficulty investigators faced. The immediate focus, as it often is, was on ensuring the children were safe and preserving the scene for evidence collection. Investigative work in such cases often hinges on a few key elements: witness accounts, physical evidence at the scene, and digital evidence. Witness accounts could include hikers who saw someone on the trail, or those who encountered the family earlier. Physical evidence could involve footprints, DNA, items left behind, or weapons. Digital evidence can be crucial. Cell phone ping data can place a person in a location, and surveillance cameras, even miles away, can show movement patterns. In this instance, law enforcement said their work yielded probable cause to arrest the suspect. He was charged with 2 counts of capital murder, reflecting the severity of the alleged crime. News reports indicated the suspect had previously taught in a nearby school district, and school officials later commented on his past employment. Those comments, inevitably, came from a place of shock and a desire to understand what had happened. The accused pleaded not guilty at his initial court appearance. That plea is typical in the early stages of capital cases, where defense counsel often needs time to review the discovery materials and prepare for the complex legal battles that follow. Capital murder charges carry the possibility of the most severe penalties under state law, and both sides prepare with intensity. Across the country, people read the headlines and ask themselves, how safe are our parks, our trails, our neighborhoods? How do we protect children when we cannot always predict danger? And how do we reconcile the image of a teacher, a symbol of comfort and mentorship, with the alleged actions of the accused? To answer those questions, we often look to the past. Historical cases, especially those that reshaped public policy, provide context. And there is perhaps no missing child case more emblematic of a nation's reckoning with child safety than the disappearance of a 6-year-old boy in Manhattan in 1979, a case that introduced the concept of the missing child into the American public consciousness in ways that continue to resonate today. On May 25, 1979, in the Soho neighborhood of New York City, a 6-year-old named Ethan went to catch a school bus for the first time on his own. He was never seen alive again. The disappearance of that little boy would become one of America's most well-known missing child cases. His face appeared on milk cartons and in public campaigns. His parents, Stanley and Julie, became tireless advocates for missing children. The case helped trigger a wave of reforms and awareness that changed how we search for and protect vulnerable children in communities across the country. For decades, the Ethan Patz case stayed in the public eye because of its symbolic power and the relentless work of his family and the investigators who never stopped searching. Tips and leads were followed, false leads were checked, and at one point, excavation of a basement near the boy's home was carried out by law enforcement on the hope of discovering new evidence. That excavation, in the early 2010s, would renew public attention to the cold case. In 2012, police arrested a man named Pedro Hernandez after he confessed to involvement in Ethan's disappearance. Hernandez was tried, and in a 2017 retrial, he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life. The conviction brought a measure of closure to some, though the boy's body was never found, and controversy and legal challenges would continue to cloud the case. In 2025, an appeals court overturned Hernandez's conviction on procedural grounds related to jury instructions about his confessions, reigniting debate about what justice looks like in long cold cases and how fragile our certainties can be. Prosecutors announced plans to seek review of that decision. Why is Ethan's story relevant here? Because it illustrates how a single child's disappearance can change policy and public consciousness, and how those changes shape the way we respond to new tragedies. The creation of public awareness campaigns, improved protocols for missing children, and systems for nationwide communication about missing persons were partly born from the public reaction to cases like Eaton's, National Missing Children's Day, and hotlines and broader media engagement are among the legacies. The Pats case proved that public attention, if harnessed properly, can yield resources and momentum that reshape law enforcement responses. And yet, the case also shows the limits of attention and the complexities that arise decades after a crime. Confessions can be contested, evidence can be sparse, and the legal system must balance a desire for resolution with the obligation to follow strict rules of evidence and procedure. Returning to the Park case, we can see some echoes. The presence of children at the scene, the national curiosity about how a teacher could be implicated, and the intense scrutiny of law enforcement actions all mirror themes that have accompanied high-profile child-related cases for generations. The Park case, though different in many details, taps into the same nerve. The mat of trust that protects families can be pulled from under them in an instant. In the days after the arrest, community leaders and education officials scrambled to respond. School districts issued statements expressing condolences and clarifying the teacher's employment history. Parents demanded answers. Violence anywhere feels inwardly personal when it occurs near centers of daily life, schools, parks, shopping centers. We build routines around trust, and those routines break when violence intrudes. Legal proceedings in such cases can be long. The initial affirmative step, an arrest and charge, launches a legal process that may include a grand jury, pretrial hearings, discovery disputes, motions to suppress evidence, jury selection, and an eventual trial, unless a plea is reached. Defense attorneys will scrutinize the evidence, witness identifications, forensic claims, digital records. Prosecutors will assemble a narrative that connects the accused to the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. For high-stakes cases, the evidentiary threshold and procedural protections are heightened because the penalties could be the most severe the law allows. When the accused is a former teacher, additional legal and professional issues appear. School districts must determine how to respond publicly, while employment law and privacy laws constrain what they can disclose. Employers often cooperate with law enforcement, but they must also protect the rights of employees who have not yet been convicted. For colleagues and students, the emotional fallout can be profound. Classrooms once filled with routine are suddenly tinted with the color of suspicion and sorrow. The role of the media in the evolution of these cases cannot be overstated. Newsrooms weigh the public's right to know against the risk of sensationalizing grief. Reporting can be relentlessly factual, and it can also be invasive. The stories that gain the most traction, the ones that populate headlines and social media timelines, are frequently the ones that frame the accused in dramatic terms. That framing shapes public perception long before a jury ever convenes. For victims' families, media attention can be a double-edged sword. It keeps the case alive in the public eye, but it also reopens wounds. There is also the matter of community healing. In the aftermath of the Park killings, people organized vigils, town halls, and calls for increased safety measures. Park officials pledged to review protocols. Law enforcement encouraged park users to remain vigilant. Local leaders balanced grief with messaging that sought to avoid panic. Parents debated new rules for their families about when and how to let children play or hike without adult supervision. Yet amid the grief and the policy questions, everyday life continues. Courts proceed at their own pace. Families attempt to find small measures of normalcy. And in the background, investigators continue their work, interviewing witnesses, re-examining evidence, and preparing for court. This case also prompts broader reflections. How do we handle the overlap between professions that inspire trust, like teaching, and the criminal acts of those who hold them? How do employers conduct background checks and vetting? What systems are in place to identify warning signs and to act on them? And perhaps most painfully, how do families rebuild after sudden, senseless loss? The answers are neither simple nor singular. Policymakers can consider more stringent review processes, increased transparency around reports of misconduct, opportunities for better mental health screening for employees in roles working with children, and continued investment in law enforcement training. Communities can build better support networks for victims' families. Schools can reevaluate how they communicate with parents in times of crisis. None of these measures guarantees safety, but they can contribute to a more informed and resilient community fabric. It is also important to underscore restraint. In the rush to understanding, we must avoid turning allegations into verdicts. The legal system exists precisely to test the state's case and to provide avenues for defense. For victims' families, that can be a bitterly unsatisfying pace, but it is central to the American criminal justice framework. The protection of rights, for victims and the accused, is part of the very fabric we fight to preserve, even as we seek justice. And we must not ignore the role of memory and legacy. The Ethan Patz case, for instance, shows how a single disappearance can catalyze national awareness and change. It also demonstrates the long arc of seeking truth. Decades can pass. Evidence can be reinterpreted. Confessions and convictions can be contested. The legal system, the media, and the public all participate in the unfolding story. When a teacher is arrested for murder, the resonance of that arrest reaches beyond the immediate community. It forces education systems to examine training procedures and abandons any illusion that trust is absolute. It forces parents to weigh common practices anew. It forces investigators once again to reconstruct a series of events from fragments. And for the victims' families, the process of seeking closure becomes a daily, arduous task. So what happens next in a case like the Park murders? First, the legal machinery engages fully. Prosecutors file charges, the defense prepares, and a calendar is set. Pre-trial hearings determine what evidence will be admissible, and discovery exchanges reveal the contours of each side's case. If the state intends to seek the death penalty, a possibility under capital murder charges in certain jurisdictions, a further layer of legal preparation follows, with specialized defenders and prosecutors often brought into the fold. Beyond the courtroom, the community continues to mourn and to organize. Vigils are held to honor the victims. Local leaders speak in carefully measured tones. Schools offer counseling services. Parks officials review signage and emergency procedures. And everywhere, conversations about safety occur in living rooms and online forums. Equally important is the question of long-term impact. High-profile crimes alter how we imagine public spaces. They inspire policy changes and sometimes inspire new programs for victim support and child safety. The national conversation about missing children, for instance, never fully returns to what it was before the 1979 disappearance that launched a generation of reforms. Families who lose loved ones in public spaces often become advocates for change. Their struggles, their perseverance, and their advocacy shape policies that may protect future families. As we reflect on this Park case and its echoes in earlier tragedies, a few truths stand out. First, the raw experience of grief is universal, even if every loss is personal and unique. Second, investigation and justice require patience, painstaking work, and adherence to legal principles. And third, community resilience depends on transparency, support, and the willingness to confront hard questions about safety, oversight, and institutional responsibility. We will watch this case, as we watch many cases, with a mixture of sorrow and a desire for answers. For the two victims and their family, the road ahead will be long. For the children who survived, childhood will forever carry a memory that no one should have to bear. For the accused, the criminal justice process will determine his fate. And for the rest of us, the case will be another painful reminder of how closely public trust and private tragedy can entwine. Some might ask whether this case will alter national policy, or whether it will pass as a local tragedy amplified by media coverage. The answer is usually both. Local tragedies sometimes prompt targeted reforms, and sometimes they feed into a broader narrative that reshapes public awareness. The disappearance of Ethan Patz led to the creation of tools and programs that continue to save lives. Other high-profile cases have led to changes in how background checks are conducted, how child abuse allegations are reported, or how parks and public spaces consider safety measures. Whatever the outcome of this particular case, it has already done one thing. It has reminded us of the fragile intersection of trust and vulnerability. It has revealed how a single moment can upend a life and how communities respond, both through grief and action. In closing, remember that the work of investigation and justice is ongoing. The legal process must run its course. Families, communities, and schools will continue to heal and to ask difficult questions. And as the archivist, I remain committed to telling these stories with care, with restraint, and with respect for both the facts and the people affected. Thank you for listening. I'm the archivist. If you found this account meaningful, return for more stories where we examine the cases that shape our society, remember the lives behind the headlines, and consider the lessons left in the wake of tragedy. Take care, and I'll see you next time.